Hi, guys, and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. Hi, everyone. Today, we are back with another History with Jackson podcast episode. And today, we welcome back a friend of the podcast. We welcome back Joshua Proven at Land of History or Adventures in History Land. It's great to have you back on the podcast, Josh. Thank you very much for coming on.
Pleasure to be back, Jackson. I always say this whenever someone lets me back on their show, that you really have to be careful who you let in the door. But yeah, great to be back. It was a lot of fun doing the last one, so I'm very happy that you re-invited me.
Well, I learned a lot from you last time. I've learned a lot from you this time as well, because today we are here to talk about your latest book, which I've very kindly been given a copy of by Helion. It is Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira. Not sure if everyone else can see that. The Maratha and Jat Campaigns, 1803 to 1806, and the emergence of an Indian army. So, firstly, Josh, I want to ask you, how did you get interested in this subject?
Well, as I suppose you could trace it back quite a long way. There was a few things. To begin with, I'd read about the Maratha War in the course of learning about the Duke of Wellington, who I've always sort of admired and wanted to learn more about. And I bought a lot of his biographies when I was a kid, because I was that cool, and made me a lot of friends.
Yeah.
But I found out later, after having read about his service in India, that there were very large misconceptions about warfare in that part of the world that date back to the prejudices and myths that arose hundreds of years ago, and they're still around today. People think that because the Duke of Wellington was involved, he must have had a lead role. This isn't really the case. People think that Indians were poor soldiers, which is also wrong and pretty insulting. So when my editor at Helion, Andrew Bamford, suggested that I could potentially pitch him an idea about a book about the British in India, my mind immediately went to the Second Maratha War, because it seems like an excellent vehicle through which I could try and address some of these misconceptions. And this sort of the idea of the common sort of conception of warfare in India and how the British took it over and things like that was sort of confirmed by talking to some of my friends, like Mani Mugdha Sharma, who is the author of an excellent book about the Emperor Akbar the Great, which you should definitely check out if you're interested in Indian history. Also, I know I seem to be plugging other people's books, but my other friend Amarpal Sidhu, who has written the books about the Anglo-Sikh Wars. So yeah, I felt that there was room for me to address some things, and hopefully that is why the book is in your hand right now, or you're considering buying it.
That's a great little pitch there. I love that. Yeah. And I definitely agree. You've gone for a good way of addressing these misconceptions, because that's what we do as historians. We work to address these misconceptions in history. And I think you've done a fantastic job of that. Now, you've gone for a very punchy, catchy title, Josh, and I really like it. It's Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira. Why is this the title that you chose?
Happily, it sort of was one of those things that came about sort of organically. Originally, it was just called the Second Maratha War Project, because it was just something I was working on, and then I gave it a code name, which was to basically take the letters, so it became Project BGGM, and that sort of sounds like Begum, which is a word for an Indian lady of good breeding, and so I called it Project Begum. And then it came to actually getting a title for it, and Helion do excellently sort of atmospheric titles. They allow authors to have some fun with that, and it just so happened that I'd been reading the accounts for a while now of Major General Arthur Wellesley and some of his junior officers, and there are I'd noticed certain trends in those accounts, mostly, and yeah, the most common was that Wellesley was obsessed to an incredible degree about getting grain and food to his army. And the only way to do that in India is to transport it on bullocks. So the two go together. The army dies if you don't have enough bullocks to get the grain. And the bullocks are contracted through grain merchants called brinjaris, and it's a whole thing in the literature of this period that everybody has to depend on the bullocks and the grain. And if all the bullocks die, then the army starves. And then with the junior officers, their priorities is slightly different, in that whenever they hear they're going on campaign, quite a few of them do try to make sure they have a lot of Shiraz and Madeira to take along with them, so they can while away the evenings on the march. So they have bullocks, grain, and good Madeira. Those are three very important things you need if you're going to go on campaign in this part of the world.
Or on campaign in any part of the world, judging by the history of warfare. So
yes, quite so. You need your transport animals and you need your food. And in India, it's specifically bullocks.
Well, it is a fantastic title, and I absolutely love it.
The best part of the book, really.
Yeah.
Why go any further? It peaks on page 1.
Yeah, everyone can see what you're about. I love it.
Yeah, it's on the tin. I'm not. By the way, I'm not actually contractually allowed to sell my own books because I make stupid jokes like that. Andrew Bamford's like, why have we let him out?
Well, hopefully, it's a good bit of information that people want to learn more about. Now, you've touched on a major character, a major person within your book, and that's Major General Arthur Wellesley. Now, who was he, and why is he so important in the context of your book, but also in the wider context of this war?
Right. Well, Arthur Wellesley is better known to us as the first Duke of Wellington. But in 1803, he was actually just one of the younger brothers of the Governor General in Bengal, who was Richard Wellesley, who we will refer to from here on as Lord Wellesley, rather than having to think up a different name for him or calling him by his first name, which is kind of weird when everybody else is referred to by their last names. So there's General Wellesley and there's Lord Wellesley, and there are two different people. There's actually other Wellesleys in India at the second. There were actually several of the brothers all out there working together. But Arthur, aka General Wellesley, he wasn't anybody massively of note at the time, but because he was the Governor General's brother, he was able to be given a great amount of jobs in the government because he could be trusted. And this allowed him to shine in a military and organizational capacity. He was probably seen at the time as a fairly capable logistical brain, quite handy to have on campaign. But I think that if he had, say, been killed in India, people would really not have taken a great deal of notice of him, except he was quite a capable officer. Why is he important to the Maratha War? Is because he was made governor of Seringapatam in 1799 after the fall of Tipu Sultan and the short-lived Muslim rulers of Mysore. And he had done some campaigns to fight rebels and bandits and had sort of been anticipating at some point a war with the Marathas. And so when a war did arise, he was in the forefront of certainly Lord Wellesley's mind when it came to selecting commanders for the different armies, and indeed for several other of the leaders of the three presidencies in India at the time: Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. So he was given command of the army, or of the, I should say, the advanced portion of the army that was originally sent into to address the issues that Lord Wellesley had involved himself in the Maratha territory, which we'll get to in a minute.
Okay, and that's really fascinating that he's come to this period and come into power through relations, which is not uncommon, but he's managed to use that to his advantage and become such an important and powerful player throughout this period.
Yeah, you know, it's all about connections in the British Army in those days. And to be honest, still today, if you have the connections, by all means use them until you get ahead. So that's why he's here, really.
Yeah. And hats off to him for using that to his advantage. So full credits to Major General Arthur there. Now, for those who don't know, India is a long way away from Great Britain. Now, obviously, being a long way away from Britain, how does this army, this British army in India, use the native population within their campaign?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question, because yes, indeed, it is a very long way away, and it obviously opens up the can of worms that is, what the hell are the British doing in India? But we can't cover that because that's a whole different podcast, and quite frankly, way over my head. But they had been involving the population of India in the defense, well, this is the British, I should say, in the defense of their commercial interests and territories since the very beginning. The East India Company was, you see, obviously, you know, it was a private commercial venture and unable to depend on the British government as a right, I should say. They got the support of the British government because the British government were invested in the company, essentially, and so they could count on support of the home government. But the East India Company itself, at first, couldn't sustain itself in India without having some sort of protection force to guard its warehouses, its, you know, port setups, its ships, and its settlements as it grew. So the easiest way to do this was to hire on local mercenaries, basically. And at first, of course, that didn't go much beyond a few watchmen. And when they started to get the authority to collect taxes and govern territories, which was given to them by the Mughals during the conquest of Bengal, they needed to sort of enlarge the establishment. And by the time of the Second Maratha War, the company was running a military force that rivaled the wartime capacity of a modest European power. And I mean, for a start, that was just sort of stupefying to a lot of people in Britain who just, some of them couldn't get their heads around that the East India Company had an army the size of the British Army. But yeah, and the way they integrated Indians into the East India Company army, and I think we do need to make a distinction here about the two phases of British sort of control in South Asia, and that is the Company Raj and the British Raj. They're two different things. And we're talking about the Company Raj with this one. And so the way they did this was to create an armed force that protected each of the three presidencies, that was formed by both European and native soldiers. And by far, the native soldiers outnumbered the Europeans.
And that's an interesting way that they've been able to incorporate these native people into this army. for their own good, but also to protect regions of India. Were there different types of ranks between these different types of soldiers, or were they all kind of on the same rank and the same level and the same power within the structure?
Well, the East India Company tried to organize its army along the lines of the British Home Army, except, like I said before, that it had to be tailored a little because there wasn't a lot of Europeans in India. So it worked pretty much like this. They had their own separate army, and the British army in Europe would send troops out to help them. Now, the East India Company army had, therefore, its own structure, and that looked a little like this. So you had European battalions. There was never very many of them. Each presidency had a Bengal, had a European regiment. So they were called, for instance, the Bengal Europeans. And then you had rather a lot more native battalions of horse and foot. And the artillery was always handled by Europeans in this period because they didn't like the idea of giving Indians artillery, even though all the native powers had artillery. But it's whatever. And these regiments were organized in a somewhat segmented way. The Europeans were just organized like British battalions with colonels, majors, lieutenants, captains, all those, and privates and sergeants and all that sort of thing. And interestingly as well, you can tell that the East India Company's army and the British army, the King's army, is different because the commissions the officers hold are different. A King's officer has it from the Crown of Great Britain, so from King George or his regent, and the East India Companies are from the East India Company. So that's where you can see that they're completely different, really. Now, the native regiments are the most interesting in terms of their organization because obviously you have a small corps of British officers or European officers technically in command of them. So you have a colonel, a major, a couple of captains, and a few lieutenants and things like that. And these guys are supposed to be the ones who are in charge and making the big decisions. However, the day-to-day stuff and essentially the entire running of the regiments are down to the native officers, and these are subadars and the various the names change between the cavalry and the infantry, but you get sepoys as privates, I believe. Havildars are sergeants, and subadars and jemadars are also in there as well. But the most important officer in the native army in the native battalions are the subadars and the subadar majors, who command the companies and who are the direct link through from the European officers. And so in terms of, you mentioned ranks and stuff, these native ranks are properly officers, but they're sort of treated like sergeants in a sort of way by the European officers because that's just sort of how they see them. And like I say, the names change if you're in the cavalry, because then you have risaldars instead of subadars, and etc. It's quite complicated, but it works pretty well, and it is developing into a very professional fighting force by the time of the Maratha War.
That was something that I was really fascinated by in the book, and I just wanted to learn more about, because it's so interesting watching those power dynamics play out, not just on a political level within India, but also structurally within the armies. And I thought that was
it is definitely, and it's interesting as well how how they chose the officers of the Indian regiments. So for instance, I mentioned in the book a chap called, I believe his name is, I think his Subadar named Khan, and he is killed, spoiler alert, in the assault on Ahmednagar. And he actually became good friends with one of the British officers, and they used to play chess in the evenings. It's actually quite an interesting dynamic there that you don't often touch upon. It was quite unusual at the time. But he wasn't terribly well liked in the regiment because he was basically given his position as a Subadar because he had brought in a lot of his family's retainers because he came from a good family. And so he brought in a lot of recruits and therefore was given an important position in the regiment. And so there's lots of different power dynamics and political sort of things going on, even at battalion level, with the appointment of officers and things. So yes, it's very interesting the way the company armies worked.
And that little bit of human side that you mentioned within your book that you just touched on was also another thing that just really shows that this is something more human. There's different levels to it. It's not just separate entities operating within one larger idea. Now they're fighting the Marathas in India. Firstly, why are they fighting them? And secondly, who are the Marathas?
Yes, well, okay. I'll start with who are the Marathas. So we'll flip that upside down.
Probably a better way to answer that question, yeah.
To my mind, it's slightly easier to answer the first one than the second one. But the Marathas were a powerful confederation of about 5 Hindu Maratha-speaking kingdoms that arose as out of the families of well-paid mounted mercenaries in the armies of 17th century Ahmednagar and Bijapur in western central India. Now, the great founder of the Maratha state, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Bhonsle, established this polity, as some call it. Some call it an empire. Outright, some people call it the Maratha Empire, not just the Maratha Confederacy. And there's some debate as to what is the proper term. I generally call it the Confederacy because it's sort of fractured a bit. Anyway, Shivaji made many of his most trusted generals Rajas, who came to form the main parts of the Confederacy that we talk about in the book. And it grew over time and played an important role in the downfall of the Mughals, and it came to dominate most of Western India from the Western Ghats up to Malwa and across the Deccan Plateau to the East Coast and as far up to Hindustan as the Himalayan barrier. So a vast swathe of territory belonged or was claimed by the Marathas. They claimed this territory generally because they were excellent in what you might basically, bluntly call a protection racket, because they commanded hordes of predatory cavalry that could lay waste to anything that they so chose to lay waste to if you didn't pay a tribute to them. And that was sort of how they got the ball rolling, and they became more structured as time went on. But that's still the eliciting of what they called the chat, or the tribute, was still a big part of Maratha politics. And so obviously, if you were an ally, then they were good friends to you. If you didn't pay up, then you could expect to see your lands burned and laid waste by their cavalrymen. And this sort of establishment was of what could have been a proper Maratha empire, I feel, was given a hard check in the 1760s when the when the Marathas were defeated at the Third Battle of Panipat, which is an incredibly important battle in Indian history, when the Afghans and the Shah Abdali came down and took Delhi, basically. Now, Delhi is very important to understanding the Marathas' place in India. Delhi is where the seat of the Mughal emperors are, or is, or was. And because of the downfall of the Mughal Empire, and the existence of the emperor still on the throne in Delhi meant that whoever controlled Delhi, and therefore controlled the emperor, could essentially rule in his name. Even the East India Company derived a lot of their power in Bengal because they had been appointed by the Mughal emperor to be tax collectors, essentially, in Bengal for him, in quotes. And so the Marathas had controlled Delhi up to this point, and indeed they captured it again and again, made themselves the guardians of the old emperor. This was done because in the aftermath of this great defeat, you get some extraordinary people coming to the fore, especially the likes of Mahadaji Shinde, who is the Maharaja of Gwalior. And he was the driving force in Maratha politics through the second half of the 18th century. He was a brilliant man who managed to keep the Marathas sort of out of the orbit of the British and re-establish it as a great power in India, and re-established Maratha power over Delhi. Now, this all falls apart in the late 18th century because all the great generation of Maratha leaders like Mahadaji and Tukaji Holkar and people like that died. Now, the other thing about the Maratha Empire / Confederacy is that it was no longer ruled by the line of Shivaji Bhonsle, who I said before founded the state. It was run by a line of people, a family essentially, that were descended from his prime ministers, and these were called the Peshwas, and they ruled in Pune in Western India. Now, by the time Mahadaji died, the Peshwas were as obsolete as the old Maratha Chhatrapatis, the old Maratha emperors. They were as obsolete almost as the Mughal emperor in Delhi. He was a figurehead. He was ruled by his own advisors and by powerful Maratha lords like the Shindes in Gwalior. And it just so happened that, you had this sort of, you had a period of time when too many of them died, and they were all quite young successors, and they came under various guardians. And the one you get left with by 1800 is a guy called Bajirao II. Now, this guy, how do you describe Bajirao II? Well, he's an idiot, basically. He's too young. He doesn't have good advisors. He's burning for revenge against a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. He's personally involved in a lot of stuff that he's just in and over his head, and he's just the wrong guy at the wrong time. And there's no rudder for the Marathas anymore, because also, like I say, Mahadaji Shinde has died. I believe one of his nephews or one of his adopted sons, I forget slightly which one, Daulat Rao Shinde, is in charge in Gwalior, and there's this whole mad purging of the Holkar family, who are the Maharajas of Indore, and a civil war breaks out, basically. in 1802, because unfortunately, in their eagerness to destroy the Holkar family, they don't kill the one they needed to kill, and that is a guy called Yashwantrao Holkar. And he escapes, and he raises an army, and we'll get to him a little later specifically, but there's a civil war breaks out between these principal figures, and the faction of allies composed of Bajirao II and Dalit Rao Sindhya, or Shinde. I'm saying shit. I want to clarify here as well, as I ramble on endlessly about this, because it actually, all of this could be its own book in itself. It's fascinating stuff and very, very sort of layered, and there's tons of stuff you can go into politically and militarily. But
it's also incredibly relevant in terms of the book as well.
Yes, it is.
So.
It is absolutely. I actually had to cut tons of it because it had to fit it into the size of the book it is, which was very sad. But there's about 5 or 6 ways of saying the name of the family of the Maharajas of Gwalior. Commonly in British vernacular, we say Sindhya. However, if you sort of watch Indian cinema, then you'll hear it given as Shinde. And I put it as Sindhya in the book, but often I will just sort of interchangeably use any name that comes into my head. So I do apologize if anybody gets massively confused. Sindhya and Shinde are the same person if I go on some tangent and forget. Anyway, he and Bajirao are defeated outside of Pune by Holkar. Bajirao runs to the British, and it is just the most ridiculous irony, because his father had done the same thing, which had literally the same thing. He had been ousted from Pune and he ran to the British, and this started the first Maratha War, which actually had gone quite well for the Marathas, I might add. That actually pretty much defeated the British and forced them to sign a treaty to leave them alone. But that was in the days when there were great men in the Maratha kingdom leading sensibly. And now you just had a bunch of kids who didn't really know what was going on and thought, well, just sort of making it up as they went along. And Bajirao II was exactly this. He ran to the British and he signed a treaty with Lord Wellesley, which said that if you restore me to my throne, what is my masnud, as it was called, then I will allow you to incorporate the Maratha Confederacy into what the British call the subsidiary system, which is where basically you become a protectorate of the East India Company. That is essentially how you get the Second Maratha War, because both Shinde and Holkar said that wasn't part of the plan. Shinde said, I'm not signing anything that you have signed because you ran away to the British. And so that's the setup. The British now are obliged to march into the Maratha territory and replace Bajirao on the throne of Pune, little knowing that nobody wants that to happen.
I'm sure that they didn't entirely mind walking into there anyway. So
no, I don't think it was a great stretch.
And it's interesting how history is yet again demonstrating that it is cyclical, by a father and son doing exactly the same thing to start 2 very similar wars. Mm-hmm. Now, in this war, and you've already touched on it very slightly, is a part where Britain goes into the Deccan Campaign. Now, what was this part of the war, and what was the aim of this particular campaign?
Well, the Deccan is a geographical expression for a large part of India, and it in English is translated as south. Now, what that means is that it is south of Hindustan and Rajasthan. and it is, yeah, it's like an old, I guess it's an old Mughal expression pretty much, that south of here is the Deccan. And it's a vast sort of upland plateau that's separated into three sort of geographic zones. You have a wet area, you have a sort of an arable mountainous area, and then you have a vast sort of desert. And it's cut by a great many rivers that make it quite difficult for large armies to maneuver around. But it was nevertheless a, in quotes, historic and very strategic marchland. People had to use it to get to where you wanted to go if you were sort of campaigning. So whoever controlled the Deccan had a great sort of position in India, and the Marathas basically controlled it. And they'd been warring with various states over who controlled portions of it for many years. Now, Pune is very much in the Deccan. It's in the Ghat region of the Deccan. The Western Ghats is a mountain range that runs down, and it's been described as like one of the spines of India. And it's therefore Pune, as the capital of the Peshwa, was the target of the initial British campaign to restore Baji Rao to the leadership of the Maratha Confederacy. So the Deccan Campaign began quite small. General Wellesley was given the task and a sort of a flying column to rush over, capture Pune, and allow and wait for Baji Rao to come back, and then we'll sign treaties and everybody will get along. But as I said before, nobody realized that, first of all, the Peshwa was a puppet, and second of all, that he did not command the absolute loyalty of the other Marathas. They thought they were basically going to be fighting this guy Holkar, because he was obviously the original rebel to the Peshwa. But as it turned out, once they had captured Pune, once Wellesley had captured Pune and everything seemed to be going well, they realized, the other Maratha Rajas aren't joyously coming over here and saying, yay, let's all sign treaties. They actually seem to be massing troops and just sort of sitting back and being quite obstinate about not abiding by the treaty that Baji Rao signed with us. So then the war changes in character. It now becomes a full-scale war against the faction of Shinde and his ally, one of the other Maratha ruling confederates, a guy called Raghoji Bhonsle, who is related to the first Shivaji Bhonsle. And so this is a full-scale war now, because they won't sign the Treaty of Bassein, as it was called. And that is the Deccan Campaign. The British now have to advance into the Deccan proper, which is sort of the arid region cut by rivers, and try and defeat these two allies here. It's not the only theatre of the war, but that is the Deccan camp. That's the objective. That's the objective and the surrounding importance of the Deccan.
And to know that they have to control such a large area of land and large area of India must have been quite daunting for them, to also to be walking through the middle of this land that is controlled by the Marathas, and to not know what they're walking into. It must be.
We should also, exactly, I mean, we should also point out that there's been a civil war going on, and from at least 1770 there's been endless cycles of wars in this part of India, and right now the place is in famine and it's almost like devoid of people, except refugees. It's an awful period of history for the ordinary people of India. They called it the Gurdi Ka Waqt, which is the time of troubles. And obviously William Dalrymple says that this basic early British period is called the Anarchy by Mughal historians. And this is just not helping anything for the people. And you have to march an army through this now. Where are you going to get the food from? Hence Wellesley's obsession with bullocks and grain.
And and it shows this need for this land, this need for control, and this need for food, because the British meet the Marathas at the Battle of Asai, if I'm saying that correctly. So
I've
what?
never actually heard it said properly myself. Weirdly enough, you don't
Yeah,
actually hear it said very often, but I say it Asai. Yeah.
Asai. So what happens at this battle? Because it's an important battle in this first part of the wider conflict.
Mm. Well, chances are, if you've ever heard of the Second Maratha War, then you will have heard of this, or then you probably know about the Battle of Assaye. It's in the Bernard Cornwell books, and chances are, if you've read about the Duke of Wellington, then you'll have heard of this battle. This is the battle for the Duke as he became the Duke of Wellington, India. It is also the most famous battle, therefore, of the Deccan Campaign. Probably because Wellington was involved in it, really, if we're honest, and it came about because he wanted to defeat the Maratha forces under Shinde and Bonsley, and up to a point of the battle, up to the point of the battle, Wellesley had been marching backwards and forwards across the Deccan at punishing speeds, trying to keep the Marathas from attacking the company ally of Hyderabad, which is an important old Mughal power in central southern India. And by September of 1803, he was so desperate, having so far not been able to get a decisive battle out of the campaign. He was writing his dispatches that he was basically willing to take any opportunity to get to grips with them and land a blow that could sort of derive some political capital from. Now, this is the atmosphere around the battle. The Marathas are sort of doing a merry dance, and Wellesley's trying to chase them around. Now, we get to the battle. So, typically, armies begin marching in India in the early hours while it's still dark and halted sometime around noon. Wellesley was marching divided in this, and at this point, in his second in command, Colonel Stevenson, was about a day's march to his flank. So at the end of a hard day's march like this, you get an interesting occurrence where Wellesley finds that Wellesley is given information that the Maratha army is actually just a few hours march away, but it's ready. It's about to break camp and leave. So he's faced with a choice. The principal thing is to just stay put, wait for the other half of the army to come up, and continue chasing the Marathas. However, there is the riskier option that he just plows ahead with his half of the army and tries to catch the Marathas and at least fix them in position or something like that, so that then Stevenson can come up and they can win a battle the next day or something. And he chooses the audacious, risky one. He's that desperate to get a battle, to win a battle against the Marathas. And so he forced marches ahead through the searing midday heat and comes upon an immense Maratha camp, which is slightly closer than was anticipated and actually looking quite comfortable, sitting on a tongue of land, which was called the Doab in India, nestled between the Kaitna and Jwa rivers. Now, upon news that the British were advancing, the Maratha rulers had delegated the coming battle to the senior officer of their regular corps, a Hanoverian called Pullman, and had nipped off somewhere for some whatever reason. They didn't seem to be massively keen on fighting, but didn't want to retreat either for some reason. I'm not quite sure, but they seemed happy enough to let the battle happen. Pullman decided to guard the line of the river with an immense amount of cannons and the regular brigades of Maratha infantry. not to mention the hordes of auxiliaries and cavalry and irregulars that were all also attending. So now Wellesley had another choice. He had found the Marathas. Should he attack them, basically? Should he attack them? Should he hold his ground? If he held his ground, there's every chance the Marathas might attack him. And there's a rule in Indian warfare that no matter how badly you are outnumbered, you must always attack. I don't know. I didn't make the rules. That's just how it works. Now, Wellesley, understanding this, decides that he will attack. Now, quite apart from making the right call in terms of the general principles of Indian warfare to always attack, he is basing this on the idea that the Marathas are not professional or capable enough to avoid a flanking maneuver. His plan is basically to drop down the river, find a ford, get round their flank and roll it up. And he thinks they won't be able to respond fast enough to that. This is completely wrong. And it gets him into a great deal of trouble because he finds his ford, he piles his little army across this ford, traps it in, therefore trapping it in between two rivers. And to his dismay, he finds that the Marathas have, of course, being people with eyes, seen him do this and just turned around. So now he is facing the front line of an untouched Maratha army with about 100 guns in front of it. Now, the numbers bandied around for the Battle of Versailles are quite insane, really. The British had between 5,000 and 7,000 men and around 17 guns, and the Marathas had somewhere between 20 and 40,000 men. The majority of that is going to be people the British don't really care about. They're like irregulars and sort of bandits and things like that, and people without discipline. They don't care about them. They can beat them any day of the week. The problem is that between 6,000 and 12,000 of them are regular sepoy battalions trained by European officers, and they are what Andy Copestake in his book calls the Army of Hindustan. It is the most professional, the most feared army in India. It has never been defeated. It is just as good as the company's sepoys, or used to be. Why is this? Because, unfortunately, those officers that trained them and those officers who built their reputations with them have been all bribed away by the crafty British Governor General Lord Wellesley. And so it's a shadow of its former self. And although Wellesley probably didn't base his tactics on this appreciation, the odds are not as bad as they seem so long as Wellesley now begins to continue making the right calls and continues to act offensively, and actually has no choice but to act offensively because he's trapped between two rivers. There's no retreat. If he retreats, the Maratha cavalry are going to tear him to pieces. So he attacks. He also attacks because the Maratha, those 100 guns of the Maratha artillery are firing at him and have knocked out all of his artillery bullocks, and he can't bring the guns up. It's an awful, awful situation, and awful for the poor sepoys and privates of the British infantry, because they now have to advance through this hailstorm of shot to get to the Maratha line. And it is described as one of the most harrowing experiences anybody had ever gone through in India, to actually walk through this to get into action. But despite having basically, sweet talked himself into a hole, Wellesley fights his way out of it based on the slightly more modern tactics of his battalions, the iron discipline of the British battalions who were in the lead, and indeed the sepoys who followed in echelon behind them. And it's a terrible sort of pounding match. It goes to and fro. He almost gets his flank turned when the Maratha cavalry overrun like 2 battalions on his right flank, but his cavalry are there watching and they charge. but he loses he drives the Marathas from the field. Everybody's stunned that the Marathas put up this fight, even without the majority of their officers. And Wellesley loses a third of his force and cannot pursue the Maratha army until Colonel Stevenson arrives later that night. He goes on the day after. That's the Battle of Versailles. People said that there hadn't been a battle seen like it in India. And it is indeed a very impressive feat of improvisation, to be honest. But there's a lot of misconceptions about it. A lot of people think that it's, Wellington at his finest, planning out everything to the last detail. No, he's making it up as he goes along. He could lose in the next instant, but he did manage to make the right calls, and did manage to get out of it. And the name Assai, as I say in the book, is on the funeral carriage in Stratfield Say.
And obviously it had a big impact on him as a person as well. And to think back and think that it's all done on the hoof kind of shows, how well he is able to walk himself out of bad situations to put himself into, but also how some of the best pieces of history have not been planned out to their entirety. Mm-hmm. So this is part of that wider Deccan campaign. How does this campaign end? Does it end with the British being in the ascendancy?
Yes, it does. And by dint of Wellesley not getting his army wiped out and himself captured by the Marathas at Assai, which really could have happened, I think, if they still had their officer corps with them and they had a general there who was in full control. I don't think we would have heard of a Duke of Wellington, to be honest. But yeah, because he won the Battle of Versailles and that he won it against such great odds, that really had a powerful effect on Maratha morale. And he follows up this victory by more hard marching, it has to be said, but by eventually tracking down and defeating the army of Raghurji Bhonsle at Argam in, I believe it's November, and then storming the fortress of Gabalgur, which is a major fortification of that Raja. And once that falls, and once both armies have been defeated by the British, and so the British have sort of demonstrated their superiority here, nobody's in the mood to fight on. Shinde asks for terms, and obviously Raghurji Bhonsle is like on the verge of having his territory basically taken away from him piece by piece. He also comes to terms. But that is essentially the end of the Deccan campaign, when Wellesley takes Gabalgur, because he has successfully removed the two major Maratha armies from the contest, and now it's basically down to the treaty work with the Governor General.
And that's an incredibly powerful move that he's taken away two of those main armies, and it dramatically strengthens Britain's position in India. Mm-hmm. Now, from the success of the Deccan campaign, we flow into the Hindustan campaign. Now, obviously, the Army of Hindustan, as you've just called it, is removed. So,
well, the Army of Hindustan is very complicated. It is massive. So part of it, yes, has been removed. A good sizable chunk, 3 brigades or more, has been removed. But there are more. So we will meet them in a minute.
Yeah. Then on that point, then Josh, what is the aim of this brand new campaign, this brand new shiny campaign, the Hindustan campaign?
Well, the Hindustan campaign is probably the more politically important campaign then. Nowadays, everybody cares only about the Deccan campaign because Wellesley was there. But at the time, Lord Wellesley was most interested in Hindustan. And that is because if you remember, Delhi is in Hindustan, and the emperor is in Hindustan. And if you're going to break the Maratha power, then take the emperor away from them. And everybody, and Wellesley has known for quite a while that the key to establishing a firm British hold over the majority of India, to cement his so-called forward policy, his subsidiary system, he needs the authority that can be given or conveyed through the guardianship of the emperor in Delhi. So that is basically the aim of this campaign. It's not really to defeat the Marathas; they're just the people they're fighting. The old Mughal capital, the seat of power, that is the goal of the Hindustan campaign. And it makes a kind of sense, because if you're Lord Wellesley, you weren't expecting this massive war with the Marathas. You were just hoping to restore the Peshwa and go home and have lunch. But since you have this war and you're going to be expending masses of money and lives, and probably going to be given hell in Parliament for it, you'd better come out of it with something, with some good compensation. So he needs the Hindustan campaign to work, and that means taking Delhi.
And it's completely understandable that you need to do what you can to make the best of a bad situation, and of a situation you didn't particularly envision happening. Now, within this new campaign, emerges General Gerard Lake, and I found him an absolutely fascinating character across the course of your book. Now, who is this general, and why? Like Wellesley, why is he important to this second Maratha War?
Well, Lake is simply put, Lake is the commander-in-chief in India. You have the governor-general, who is sort of like the political head, the most important man in India, the superior person appointed by the board of governors and directors in conjunction with the British cabinet. But and then you have the commander-in-chief, who is the senior military man in India, and he's sent out by the British government. Now, Lake was a highly experienced soldier. He was 55 years old when he was in India. He was a former guardsman. He'd fought in the 7 Years' War. He was a devoted father. He rode excellently, gambled badly, dressed neatly, and believed wholeheartedly in firm offensive action wherever it was called for. And he was rather beloved for this reason by the Sawars, or troopers of the Bengal native cavalry, who called him Lik Sahib Bahadur, and Bahadur being a honorific, which sort of means noble warrior or honorable. And it was a nickname that was often given to well-respected officers, like the very famous Colonel James Skinner was I believe known as Bahadur at some points, as well as Sikandar Sahib, because as well there was a habit in India of nicknaming people Alexander, as in Alexander the Great, as a shorthand for someone who was a brave and successful fighter. Because fun fact, if anybody doesn't know, Alexander the Great rocked up into India in his last major campaign, and well, it didn't go so well. Anyway, different podcast. Anyway,
different book.
Yeah, different book, which I would actually love to write. But this is Lord Lake, Lik Sahib, and he is the man who is going to try and take Delhi. He's also a very capable courtier. He's very elegant. He always dresses very well. He makes sure he always appears to his men with his powdered wig and things like that. And for that reason, he gets on quite well with the prickly and just downright difficult Lord Wellesley, who only really worked well so if he was friends with the individual, and Lake managed to sweet talk him into letting him conduct this campaign the way he felt it should be conducted as a soldier.
And it's fascinating that friendships work on this kind of level, but also that he's being given these nicknames by the native population that shows that not only is he revered by the British, but he's revered by Indian soldiers as well. Now, in this,
I mean, I think Irish Catholics probably had some different names for him, but
yeah, possibly not one, not one for this pod, maybe another podcast. But within this Hindustan campaign, we start to see the influence of an old English enemy in India. We start to see French influence in India. So how is this French influence seen in India, and who's kind of leading this French power within India?
Right. Well, the French power in India is a funny thing in the Second Maratha War because it doesn't exist technically. It's you have to understand the kind of weird mind of Lord Wellesley to understand his constant obsession with driving the French from India, because technically French power in India had been broken during the 7 Years' War and the early, sort of like the 1770s, 1780s, when they lost Pondicherry. All that remained of French power in India practically were the mercenaries who came in and trained the armies of many of what the British called, in quotes, country powers, so the independent Indian states. And the current commander-in-chief and subadar in Hindustan was indeed a former French cloth salesman named Perron. Now, the Army of Hindustan, which we referred to before, was a very large entity. And in India, large armies were paid for and supplied through the territories they were sort of garrisoned in. Therefore, the governor of Hindustan used the revenue from the land to pay the troops. And so Perron was actually ridiculously wealthy because he was governor of Hindustan and commander-in-chief of the army. That is why Lord Wellesley now and again calls Hindustan, I believe, like the French territory or something like that. He actually believes that this is being held for France or something like that. His brief, one of his briefs going out to India as Governor General was to remove French influence, the last vestiges of French influence in India. But that meant basically plucking out all of the French mercenaries who had become generals in the different Indian states. They did it in Hyderabad, and now the Marathas were the next go. And basically, if you were a Maharaja or a Nawab or a Peshwa, and you had French officers in your army, the British were going to come for you at this point because they just felt it was such a threat to India to have Frenchmen messing around with large amounts of sepoys. So that's the French influence that we're referring to here. It's got really nothing to do with Napoleon. There was a lot of rumors going around about various French generals who had been famous in India, who had gone back, were now buddies with Napoleon and were planning to take India. But that's kind of the core of it. So that's the French power in India at the second. It's very disconnected from France. It's very much to do with India and personalities. But nevertheless, yes, there are a lot of Frenchmen in the Army of Hindustan. Perron is one of them. He's the man in charge. He's one of many nationalities of Europeans working in the armed forces of India during what you might call the military revolution that occurred in India around the second half of the 18th century. There are British, Swiss, Italians, Hanoverians, various Germans messing around as well. But it just so happened, yeah, that Xindei's commander-in-chief is a Frenchman, a kind of a middling commander, but an interesting guy nonetheless. And this was a red flag to a bull to the xenophobic, Lord Wellesley. A major part of Lake's objective was to remove him, and he did. Some people say that Perron was basically bribed from the start. He was in Lake's pocket and had no intention of actually fighting the British. And he was basically, well, I've become a millionaire while I've been in India. I'll just cash up and go back to Europe. I don't care about these people. And indeed, he was very lackluster at the beginning of the campaign. He lost the city of Aligarh early in the campaign. Lake just drove his troops from it, captured it. He surrendered it, I think, a month later or something like that. And so Lake then drives into Hindustan in August with the so-called, he called it the Grand Army of the Doab and Jamuna, or Jamna. And he marched north from Kanpur, which was called Cawnpore, and he took Aligarh. And there was a raft of defections from then on of European officers in Maratha service. The greatest blow to the Maratha cause was Lord Wellesley issuing a proclamation before the fighting started, saying that any European found in arms against the company will basically be treated as a traitor. But if you leave now, then we'll give you a job, we'll give you some money. So that really smoothed the wheels of the campaign from the beginning, and because it caused factionalism of who was going to replace them, and it was just total mess. And so, with this in mind, Lake appears before Delhi in short order. They engaged the Maratha army defending Delhi on the 11th of September, and the British drove the Marathas into the Jamna and won the battle and became the guardians of the emperor. The emperor was delighted because he wasn't happy with the Marathas, and he'd been in correspondence with the governor general, saying, "Come and rescue me," kind of thing, because I guess he just wanted to switch overlords or something like that. I'm not really sure. Or he thought he would get a better deal with the British. Anyway, they captured Delhi successfully, and they got rid of the last French officers. The commander-in-chief of that army was a chap called Louis Buchan, who was, again, one historian outright calls him a poltroon. And he didn't do very well at all. Although in his report, I believe he said that he did his best. Maybe he did. I don't know. Then Lake basically goes and mops up the rest of the Army of Hindustan, and he meets them under the command of Xindei's new Subadar in Hindustan, Ambaji Inglia, at the Battle of Laswari, and he defeats that army. The Battle of Laswari is a very similar battle to Assai, in that a lot of the same motivation is there from the British side. They really want a battle. They really need to finish this campaign before the weather turns bad. And they kind of fall into a trap, and they get pounded by artillery, and they just advance through the storm of fire, and the Marathas have to be driven from the field by repeated cavalry charges and bayonets because they just won't run. Casualties are horrendous, but again, the British do manage, because they're slightly more modern in terms of how they've been trained and the tactical doctrines, winning the field. And Lake decides that is sort of and then Lake turns on our boy Holkar, who I mentioned earlier, and he chases him off into the fringes of Rajasthan, and feels that the campaign is over, and he goes and puts his troops into cantonments, and that's technically, and he thinks it's the end.
Well, we've seen that Wesley's anti-French doctrine, the Wesley doctrine, as I'm probably saying,
Yeah.
the Wesley doctrine in India, and the combination of late success getting to Delhi kind of shows that the British position is strong in India, and they're in a fantastic position as they're able to control the country through possession of the emperor. Now you've mentioned Prince Holkar.
Mhm.
How much of a threat was he? You mentioned in your book at this point you believe it's the end of the Second Maratha War, and suddenly Holkar comes in with a bit of power, a bit of gusto about him. So how much of a threat is this Prince Holkar?
Well, Holkar is one of my favorite characters from this war. Actually, he's a hard drinking, hard riding, swashbuckling, womanizing, one-eyed, illegitimate son of a Maharaja, and he, as I said before, he was the illegitimate son, I believe, of Tukaji Holkar, and he was sort of the regent for his nephew Kandirao, who was captured during the Maratha Civil War. His capture and the slaughter of a great many of the Holkar family was why the Maratha Civil War happened and why Bajirao eventually had to flee. Holkar, in a way, is the underpins this entire thing. He's basically the reason why they're in this mess now, in a way, because he decided to, because he'd been forced into a corner and he had to come out fighting. And his story is amazing, to be honest. It's full of sort of drama and ups and downs. He gets defeated. He has to go into exile. He comes back with this sort of ragtag army of bandits and pindaris and Pathan freebooters and things like that. And this messy bunch of guys come together and they defeat Bajirao, and he goes and flees to the British. And then when the Maratha War starts, he backs off. He leaves Pune. He abandons the puppet Peshwa, as they called him, that he had placed on the throne when Bajirao ran away. And he just sort of he sits on the sidelines. He doesn't join the Confederates because they're his enemies, and he doesn't join the British because he doesn't trust them either. He just waits to see how things pan out. Now, unfortunately, while that makes quite a lot of political sense given his background, and he really shouldn't trust Shinde at all. It is really bad for the Marathas because that means they're fractured. He is an excellent commander, and a very large chunk of, therefore, the Maratha Confederacy does not fight in unison with the rest of them until this point. And at this point, he's sort of been driven into a part of India called Malwa, where he's just sort of been extracting tribute from various princes. And like I say, Lake goes and says, war's over, Holkar's not a problem. We'll deal with him next year if he chooses to fight at all. Well, like you say, Holkar reappears, and he does so with considerable flair. He was a truly gifted leader and a redoubtable soldier, and really the guy you needed to have a more central role, and to be honest, when dealing with the East India Company. But yeah, he reappears, and it's not necessarily that he has a great deal of power that the British feel they need to be afraid of. They don't really know what his game is at this point. But for some reason, but he feels that now is the time to enter the war, probably because certain things happened which he saw as opportunities, and he chose this point to enter the war actively, and he does so quite dramatically. And he upsets the apple cart quite a lot, actually, as far as Lake is concerned.
And he does upset, like you said, he does upset this apple cart. So basing on that point of the apple cart, how successful were the British in repelling his threat? Because I know there's been a slight change in who's leading some of the British troops, and a slight change in the skill level of some of the people leading these troops.
Yes. So when Lake heads back to his winter quarters and he puts his troops to bed basically for the year, he leaves a small, well, he leaves a decent sized column of troops on the Hindustan frontier. This is under a officer called Colonel Monson, and Monson's job is basically to make sure that Holkar doesn't come back. You know, if Holkar appears, just probably to fight him if you have to, just make sure he doesn't come back into Hindustan and cause trouble. He had one job, you know. He failed at that one job. He got it into his head to actually advance into Malwa and parts of Rajasthan at a really bad time of year, when the rains were coming, and Holkar pounced on him. He came at him and just disintegrated that division. He forced it to Monson was just so indecisive, and this is really weird because throughout the campaign, Monson actually had been a very brave and capable officer that had led several of the famous attacks on several cities, and one officer, I think, later said that he was exactly the sort of man you needed at the top of a siege ladder, but in charge of a force of true independent force. The guy didn't know what to do. And this is true. He advanced to try and attack Holkar, got scared when he thought that a second British force that Wellesley had sent up from the Deccan was retreating, and ran away just as Holkar was coming to fight him. So he basically presented his back and kept running from there pretty much. And Holkar just took little pieces out of him as he ran, until eventually, after fording several rivers and taking tremendous casualties, losing his supplies, his guns, there was a panic. Nobody knows what caused it, but everybody was so demoralized by this point that the entire division just lost all discipline, became a mob of fugitives, and ran back all the way to Agra. And so you could say to begin with, no, the British didn't do terribly well at all at dealing with Holkar. And because what happened now was that Holkar, all of Western Hindustan was basically open to him. He could go wherever he wanted. He had endless choices. He could besiege Agra. He could go up to Delhi and attack Delhi. Lake wasn't in the field anymore. The army was scattered. So Holkar decided to attack Delhi. He sent his regular infantry up there, besieged Delhi, sent his cavalry down into the Doab to harass Lake, who was frantically getting an army back together and marching to relieve Delhi. And this is where some control is reestablished. Lake does manage to relieve Delhi, despite a very, very punishing march to get there. But it's caused endless trouble, and that apple cart, there's apples everywhere, and it's going to take an awful lot, and it took an awful lot of effort, money, and lives to restore what had been won at the end of 1803.
And to me, the way you write about it, Monson definitely has a degree of incompetence, or
Yeah, it's like
fear of Holkar.
he does. It's indecisiveness. He's paralyzed by indecision in the face of this relentless attack by Holkar, and he seems to just feel everything I am going to do is wrong, so I can't do anything. And of course, Holkar capitalized on that.
And that swings the balance of power. It turns
Mm.
this war on the British side from an offensive war to a defensive war. And we see the British lose a 5-year record at Jat against the Jats.
Mm-hmm.
So what
Yeah.
happened here? Who were the Jats and how did they lose this 5-year record?
Yes. Well, so the Jats were one of the warrior peoples of Western India, and their capital was at a place called Bharatpur, and this was reputed as a sort of a bulwark of Hindustan. The Jats were famed Hindu warriors that had made a name for themselves in antiquity and against the Mughals in the 17th century. Their capital was surrounded with large, massive mud walls and huge ditches. Now, the British had actually made a treaty with the Raja of Bharatpur, whose name is Ranjit Singh, when Lake was marching through the area after taking Agra in 1803-1804. And the Raja of Bharatpur, however, on seeing Holkar's early successes, had sent diplomats and messengers to Holkar saying, "I'll help you drive the British out." So he was a defector to the Maratha side. Unfortunately, at just about the time he was about to commit his forces to the struggle, Lake, as I said, broke the siege of Delhi and destroyed Holkar's regular infantry and artillery, then proceeded to chase him with a sort of flying column and cavalry and horse artillery to, I think it is to, I need to check, yeah, Farrukhabad, where he surprised his camp and scattered it, and Holkar had to flee. So Holkar does now legitimately seem to be out of the picture, and that leaves Bharatpur and the Jats in a really, really bad situation, because now Lake feels personally insulted and betrayed because the deal was made with Lake. And Lake is like of the old school. He's quite a sensitive man. He feels this betrayal very keenly, and he wants to make an example of the Jats. So he sends troops to attack the Jat fortresses. And Ranjit Singh tries to say, okay, no, my bad. Let's not do this. But Lake wants to make an example of the Jats now. And with Holkar battered away for the moment, he marches down. They storm the fortress of Deeg, take it with considerable losses, and then appear before Bharatpur in, I believe, January of 1805. Now, that is where you get, this is where we can discuss this reputation the British have about sieges. As far as I can gather, the British have never failed to take a city or fortress. In the last 5 years, I'm pretty sure beyond that as well, to be honest, it's probably more than 5 years. In 5 years, they have never failed to take a city. They were the greatest fortress breakers since the Mughals. One British officer, James Young of the Bengal Horse Artillery, literally writes that the Jats need to recognize them as siege lords. And you know, the ability of the British, and indeed it was fairly accurate, to take whatever fortress they came across, gave them great sort of political power, because the fortresses are the places places of refuge for any country, and if they are rendered obsolete by the skill and engine of the engineers of your enemy, then you have no defense. So the British placed a great deal of store on their ability, and they were quite puffed up about it, to take whatever fortress they came at. And sometimes they would just be so cavalier about it that they wouldn't even bombard the walls. At Ahmednagar during the Deccan Campaign, Wellesley just had ladders made and they just poured over the walls. And at Aligarh, they just they brought out guns and blew the gate open and then charged in. This is unheard of types of ways of storming cities that hadn't been seen in Europe like since the 17th century. So they come to Bharatpur with this attitude, but they receive a rude shock.
And what was this kind of rude shock and awakening for the British?
Well, I think it comes down to, cutting a long story short, it comes down to the pretty bad state Lake's army is in by this point. They've been like campaigning for the better part of 1803 and now well into 1804, most of 1804, and now it's 1805. Their supplies are pretty bad. They're strung out all the way back to Delhi. It's a fairly long march from Delhi to Bharatpur, and all the way down back into the Doab to Kanpur. The supply lines are ridiculously overstretched, and Holkar, who is still messing around, takes massive advantage of this and descends on the supply lines with his cavalry, and brings in some of his allies, like the famous Pathan freebooter Amir Khan, and they make things very difficult for the British, who are now trying to break into Bharatpur. At first, though, it does seem like, as usual, the British will just sort of shrug off the problems and take the place, because they construct their batteries, they bring up their guns, a couple of 18-pounders. They don't encircle it. They just come up against the part of the wall they want to attack, and they batter a hole in it. Unfortunately, the Jats have this nasty habit of rebuilding the breaches. So by the time the British attack, there are new fortifications inside the rubble. The British attack Bharatpur by breaches and by escalade 4 times. And each time they are repulsed with tremendous losses. This goes on through the winter, and everybody is just stunned. And to be honest, after the 4th assault fails, they realize that as the army stands at the moment, it will take maybe the rest of the year to take this place. And we don't have that kind of time, because, like I say, Holkar and Amir Khan are running around. Everybody across India has heard that the Jats have held Bharatpur, and Shinde is gathering his army again, and all the rest of the Marathas are making noises like, okay, well, maybe we didn't need to surrender too quickly after all. Maybe we can get these guys. And so Lake has to sign a treaty with the Jats saying, pay me an indemnity and I'll go away.
And that's a fairly good deal for
very
Lake
good
from
deal.
that point. So the issue of the Jats kind of goes away, and Lake fades away from this siege to get away from this
he
failure.
gets away from that place as fast as he possibly can. I don't want to hear the name Bharatpur again.
Yeah. So what happens to Holkar? What happens to Holkar after this campaign to defeat the British?
Well, I mean, the Holkar has been basically plagued by bad luck and bad timing through this entire war, basically. And there's no one to blame but himself, really, for that, because he could have thrown in with the other Marathas and sort of faced everybody as one united front, but he didn't. They played factionalism, and it came back to bite them. This is the only real thing. This is one of the main things that aided the British, was the disunity of the enemy. Holkar did try. And Shinde and Raghojee Bhonsle, even the Bhonsle Chhatrapati, the Raja of Satara even got involved. They all tried to form a coalition to continue the war with the British, but they couldn't get along. They couldn't work out a treaty. The British, it was taking too long. The British were going to come at them, and they hadn't worked anything out. So it all sort of fell apart, and Shinde submitted to the British again and sent his army home. Holkar therefore had to go on the run. He fled north, and Lake pursued him. He took a flying detachment and pursued Holkar across Rajasthan and into Punjab, where Holkar had gone to try and form another alliance with the Sikhs. Specifically, the Sikh Maharaja of Lahore, Ranjit Singh, very similar name to the ruler of Bharatpur, sorry about that. But this guy has the wonderful nickname Sher al-Punjab, which is the Lion of Punjab. And he's the great man of Sikh history. He's the guy who unites the Sikh Confederation and forms the Sikh Empire that the British encounter in 1845. And Ranjit Singh was everything Holkar was, including only having one eye. But he was also a much more gifted politician than Holkar was. And while he would, I doubt, have ever ruled out of challenging the British if the circumstances were right, he could see that the circumstances were not right to challenge the East India Company right now. Holkar came up to him, and he was trying to appeal to him as a sort of as a Hindu brother, and we can go and fight the Firangis and drive them out of India and all that sort of thing. And Ranjit Singh was just, he's like, I know what's been going on in the Maratha Confederacy. You've lost. And all that's going to happen if I get involved now is that all of Punjab is going to be invaded, and it's going to end badly. So sorry, not today. And with that, when Ranjit Singh says, now is not the time to fight the British, nice job, but not now, Holkar surrenders. And that properly is the end of the Second Maratha War, which kind of has two phases. You have the war against Shinde and the war against Holkar. And when Holkar surrenders, the politicians can get to work.
And it's a fascinating timeline, a fascinating set of events that led to this war. And as you just alluded to, it definitely sounds like the British won. But what also happened to Anglo-Indian relations in the aftermath of this British victory?
Well, so politically speaking, nobody was very happy with Lord Wellesley. His whole forward policy of aggressively trying to gain a monopoly over most of India, which stemmed from some queer kind of attempt to stop all the wars happening in India, while at the same time ignoring the fact that a great deal of the wars in India were caused by the British. This idea of basically conquering India so as to make it peaceful was very unpopular in Britain, and it was also eye-wateringly expensive. And then they start hearing that what do you mean Lord Lake has been defeated by a bunch of people we've never heard of before? What do you mean these casualty lists here? What is happening now? Wellesley's lost the plot. He's let this get out of hand. And also people were noticing that the subsidiary system was not annexation, it was the creation of multiple dependencies, all of whom would now depend on the British to do practically everything for them. And most people in Parliament were just saying, isn't that just going to create a massive amount of opportunity for like dodgy dealing, and isn't it going to bankrupt us, and isn't it going to ruin all the governments that are touched by it? So Wellesley basically is removed on the score of the Second Maratha War, even though it was strategically and tactically successful, and he did manage to capture Delhi and remove the last great obstacle to British domination over India. Politically speaking, he'd crossed several lines, and everybody wanted him to come back and basically answer for what he'd been doing there. So Wellesley's out of the picture. Lord Wellesley is. General Wellesley also leaves very soon after. He goes back and obviously becomes the Duke of Wellington, and famously says that he learned basically everything he ever knew about soldiering after he left India. Lord Wellesley is replaced by the Marquis of Cornwallis, who is the same Cornwallis from the American Revolution, by the way. Cornwallis died in India before he could really settle the Maratha, the question of what to do with the Marathas, because no proper sort of treaty had been signed yet, and nobody really quite knew what to do with them, or whether to punish them, or to take their cities away, or to remove them from power, like remove the main players from power. Nobody knew what to do. So Cornwallis died before he could sort of fix all of the problems that Lord Wellesley had created, because that was why he was sent out there. And his temporary successor, George Barlow, finalized the treaties, and they were actually quite generous to the Marathas. They got to keep their capitals, they got to keep their titles, they were given back a great deal of the land that was taken from them, except for Delhi and the Doab region, which became known as the ceded and conquered territories. And yeah, and Anglo-Maratha relations kind of cooled off. The British stepped back from them, and unfortunately allowed them to then go and persecute the Rajput states who had depended on the British for protection. But now, because the British were trying to retract this expansionist policy and do non-interventions, as had been the case before Lord Wellesley had come to power, this now left a great deal of states in northwestern India very vulnerable to the Marathas, and so it was not a pleasant situation. Nothing massively good came out of the Second Maratha War, one way or another, really.
And yeah, I think that's the best way to say it. Nothing good comes out of it, but nonetheless, I know something that good came out of it, and it is this book. Josh, I'm a big fan of it, and I'm a big fan of what you have told us today, or taught us today. So, as you know, Josh, I like to ask one fun question to all our guests. Now, as you are the king of niche, and you have researched several amazing characters from history across the course of your writing and research career, which three characters would you like to sit down and have dinner with?
I think that we'll stay in India for this. 3 is a small number. I have to say there's quite a lot to choose from. I would I think that let's invite, who should we invite? Let's invite Ranjit Singh, the Maharaja of Lahore. Let's invite as well. Let's invite him and Gandhi. And we're going out of period now. And then maybe we'll return to the period and also have a chat with Mahadaji Shinde.
And they're three fantastic choices. Absolutely amazing choices.
I'm not sure what Gandhi will do with these two guys, but it'll be interesting. Give me time to talk to him while the other two argue.
Yeah. Well, I love that dinner party there. So, Josh, if our listeners want to learn more about the period, what kind of books and places would you like to send them to learn more?
Well, if you want to learn about the East India Company, then the most accessible general books that cover the entire period from its sort of arrival in Indians from like 1603 to 1858, then you can't do any better than John Kay's The Honourable Company, and then follow that up with William Dalrymple's The Anarchy. You can then also delve into various there are a couple of good books about the mercenaries that served in the Maratha forces, and indeed the forces of many of the other Indian states. One of the oldest ones is Military Adventurers in Hindustan, which was written in the 19th century, but it's very good, and it's got a good sort of spread of different. It's got a good spread of subjects and characters that it covers. Then I would highly, if you want to sort of delve into, military operations and things, then have a look at the the journals and memoirs that I used to write this book, because people like James Young, Pester, and Wellesley's officer of engineers. I for some reason I can't get his name into my head at the second, but yeah, all of these guys. Also Wellington's India Dispatches. These are amazing. Also, I mean, there's also a great book about the Indian Army of this period is the one written possibly by an actual sepoy, which is the memoirs of Sita Ram, and it's called From Sepoy to Subadar. And people can, if people want to read it, then they can get into the debate about who Sita Ram actually was as they do that. But I do recommend it. It's a very interesting book. And then also the memoirs of the Pathan soldier of fortune Amir Khan, and also in a similar vein, the memoirs of James Skinner by Bally Fraser. Will give you an excellent idea of what it's like to go to war in India. There is quite a long list. I mean, I really should add again William Dalrymple's White Mughals, which is just a tremendous story. And I think if you just like to read about history, you should read that. And then my friends. I mentioned at the beginning, Mani Mugdha Sharma has written a book about a very timely book, which reflects on our own time as well, about the Emperor Akbar and sort of enlightened the idea of an enlightened leader. And if you want to learn about Ranjit Singh and how his Sikh empire came into contact with the British Empire in the last great war between the British and an Indian power in the 1840s, then my good friend Amarpal Singh Sidhu is the man to look out. He has written the book books about the First and Second Anglo-Sikh War. And then, as well, if you want to look into Sikh history itself, look at Kashi House, which is part run by a good friend of mine named Parmjit Singh, and they do tremendously good books. They're beautiful books. They're lovely books to own, and they cover like the Sikh warrior ethos, history, art, culture, and things like that. You will have to stop me, okay, because I will go on.
And that's like that. You've given a wealth of resources for our listeners, a mix of primary and secondary sources. What more could any historian want as a list of recommended texts? Now, we're here for you, Josh, as well. So if our listeners and watchers want to get a copy of your book, where can they find it?
You can get it. You can get it from Helion's website, the publisher's website, which I believe means I get a slightly bigger cut of whatever royalties is derived from the price of the book. You can also get it from Amazon. And even if you get it from Helion, I would appreciate a review on Amazon, as we all do, because apparently that's where the reviews live. Or if you have a blog, please do. I would love to read what you think of it. Myself, you can find me at Land of History, like you said at the beginning, on Twitter. Feel free to stop by and ask a question. I'll do my best to interact with you and say hi.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Josh. You've been a fantastic guest once again, and you've taught us such fantastic history about an area of history which is not often looked at. So thank you very much, Josh.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you very much, guys, for listening. If you guys enjoyed listening to myself and Josh, please make sure that you leave a like, a review, and possibly even share to other people who you think would enjoy this episode. So thank you very much, guys. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the History with Jackson podcast.